Yeah, I'm going to speak more on Ranciere than on Badiou, mostly because I thought that's what I was doing. But I will talk a bit about Badiou's relationship to Ranciere. Type this up again. It's perhaps a bit formal, but in the end, I think that I am myself more Rancierean than anything else, so you won't be surprised to find that I believe his work is well worth attention. My intention here, though, is really only just to outline the work of Jacques Ranciere. First, to provide a quick periodization of his theoretical writings. Second, to sketch his political theory. And third, to explain something about what he regards as the importance of the aesthetic. I only hope that such brief treatment doesn't do any serious injustice to Ranciere's remarkably rich thought. So first, the trajectory of Ranciere's work. Ranciere began his career as an associate of Althusser, indeed as a contributor to the volume Reading Capital. In 1975, however, he forged out on his own in an extremely public way when he published La Leçon d'Althusser, criticism of Althusser. Having left Althusserian Marxism behind, Ranciere launched a career that, so far, nicely divides into three periods. He dedicated the first of these periods to what must, in the end, be called historical work, from his massive analysis in Knights of Labor of the Saint-Simonian and Icarian movements, through his more theoretically inflected, but still quite historical, The Philosopher and His Poor, which I think is necessary reading, to his beautifully written and almost biographical study of Joseph Jacotot entitled The Ignorant Schoolmaster. Ranciere's trek through the 1980s found him focused almost exclusively on the French labor movement of the 19th century. This culminated in a theoretical study, The Names of History, in which he began to sort out both the political and the aesthetic consequences of his historical work. The Names of History thus marked his transition into a more explicitly theoretical period, almost exclusively focused on politics. The 1990s thus saw the publication of On the Shores of Politics, Short Voyages to the Land of the People, and his most extended and discussion of political theory, Disagreement. I'll be dwelling on this work a little bit further on, particularly to spell out Ranciere's theory of democracy. More recently, Ranciere published Hatred of Democracy, fantastic little book that seems in some ways to be out of place in the trajectory of his thought because it's more recent, but he could not have written it in the 1990s for reasons I'll explain later. Beginning with the publication in 2000 of Aesthetics and Politics, Ranciere has embraced a strong aesthetic turn. This turn, as I will argue, was anticipated from the very beginning of his historical work, though it was long in preparation. His aesthetic work, though, does not mark an abandonment of political questions. Indeed, for Ranciere, the turn amounts to a sharpening and a clarification of his political interests. His works on aesthetics are rapidly proliferating. In addition to Aesthetics and Politics, the past decade has seen the publication in English of The Future of the Image, Aesthetics and Its Discontents, Film Fables, The Flush of Words, and The Emancipated Spectator, and two more of his works are due out in English next month, The Aesthetic Unconscious and Dissensus. So from history to politics to aesthetics, each shift marked by increased rigor. So let me now begin to spell out the particulars of what Ranciere has been doing in all of this work. So the question is, what is democracy for Ranciere? Ranciere begins his political work by giving critical attention to Aristotle's distinction between logos and phone, between articulated speech and mere voice. Aristotle explains, this is in the Politics, first book of the Politics, quote, "Speech is something different from voice, which is possessed by other animals also, and used by them to express pain or pleasure. For their nature does indeed enable them not only to feel pleasure and pain, but to communicate these feelings to each other. Speech, on the other hand, serves to indicate what is useful and what is harmful, and so also what is just and what is unjust. This Aristotelian commonplace can be used to clarify the nature of what usually goes by the name of society. Society is that curious setup in which a ruling class both regards and does not regard a dominated class as capable of speech. That is, in order to be the ruling class must convince the dominated class that it is incapable of speech, that it has a voice to indicate pleasure and pain, but that it has no speech with which to express something about justice or injustice. Ironically, though, society so composed doubly grounds itself on the dominated class's actual capacity for speech. First, the very idea of domination is rooted in the desire to have speaking animals, not just mere animals, at one's service, since only these can do the work of the artisan. Second, because the thusly dominated human beings are indeed speaking animals, and so have the capacity to recognize the injustice of the situation of domination, and because this in turn means that the ruling class has the task of convincing the dominated that they are without the capacity of speech, the ruling class both assumes and utilizes the speaking capacity of the dominated precisely in the work of explaining to the dominated that they are incapable of speech. It's marvelous irony. Out of this remarkable situation, according to Ranciere, democracy emerges, or what is the same thing for Ranciere, politics emerges. According to Ranciere, politics is the democratic self-assignation of a name, the people, to the dominated, and thus the forced inclusion of an otherwise essentially indiscernible part of society. For Ranciere, then, classes and conflict, what he terms disagreement, only come into existence in the moment of encounter staged by the self-naming of the people, resistance. Though above I employed the language of the ruling class and the dominated class in describing the pre-political situation, Ranciere is quite clear that these classes only come into existence in any reified sense when the people name themselves as speaking. Class antagonism, as Marx laid out definitively in the Communist Manifesto, is not a given, but rather has to be brought into existence by communists. Here one can mark the break with Althusser in Ranciere's work. Marxism is not and cannot be Marxism is not and cannot be for Ranciere a science of history. Rather, it must in every instance be the work of creation, of producing the class antagonisms that will have made up history. Further marking the distance between himself and Althusser, as well as marking the proximity between himself and Alain Badiou, Ranciere gives the name of subjectification to the process by which the indiscernible people name themselves and establish genuine conflict between themselves and the ruling class whose existence, and therefore limits, they fix. Implicitly recognizing the possibility of such subjectification in advance, the ruling class employs what Ranciere regards as the polar opposite of politics, what he calls policing. The work of the police, and Ranciere is careful to distinguish the petty police, mere police officers, if you will, as much as the state apparatus, from the much larger and more complex social machinery of policing. The police is the set, quote, I'm quoting Ranciere here, the set of procedures whereby the aggregation and consent of collectivities is achieved, the organization of powers, the distribution of places and roles, and the systems for legitimizing this distribution. According to Ranciere, the work of policing is unfortunately what usually goes by the name of politics, particularly in the name of Aristotle, though policing is precisely what keeps politics from taking place. Politics thus always emerges as, quote, an extremely determined activity antagonistic to policing, whatever breaks with the tangible configuring whereby parties and parts or lack of them are defined. Political activity is whatever shifts a body from the place assigned to it or changes a place's destination. Politics, in short, amounts to a break with the police, just as policing always undertakes to postpone or to dissimulate the possibility of politics. What happens, though, once democracy is dawned, once political activity has been undertaken? Is one to suppose that the machinery of the police has been forever broken? Hardly. In fact, according to Ranciere, policing responds to democratic happenings with one of three political philosophies, to which he assigns the names archipolitics, parapolitics, and metapolitics. And this last name should not be confused, if anyone's familiar with what Badiou is called, metapolitics. Each of these political philosophies attempts in one way or another to obscure anew the radical distinction between politics and policing, made startlingly clear in the course of the political event. And each deserves at least a brief word here. Archipolitics, Ranciere associates with Plato. There is little question that Plato's entire philosophical enterprise was in crucial ways a thoughtful response to precisely the singular political invention of Athenian democracy. Plato's famous response is the construction of the Republic, with its singular notion of justice. Ranciere reads the construction of this notion of justice, rooted in a telling Platonic myth, as an attempt to ensure that the people are assigned in his projected society to the time-consuming work of artisanship, that they never dabble in poetry or other sophistic enterprises that might help them to realize that they are speaking beings. Archipolitics thus erases the distinction between politics and policing. Given the task of policing themselves according to the virtue of temperance, the artisans believe they are performing their part in the work of justice, even as they obliterate its real possibilities. Parapolitics, in turn, is associated with Aristotle. This political philosophy embraces the reality of the conflict staged by the democratic upsurge, but reifies it by making of the newly included people one of so many parties in the political entanglement. The emphasis here is on the center, on the governmental offices to which every party, including that of the people, aspires. Thus, what democracy stages as disagreement essentially disappears, reappropriated into the rationality of constitutional systems, a la Habermas. The process of subjectification is thus derailed, subjects being replaced by partisan politics and the false consciousness of the voter. Here again, the distinction between politics and policing is obliterated. Politics becomes nothing more than one's attempt to gain a place of some power within the policing system.